we have this whole perception if someone is cynical. There's actually research that shows that we judge those who are cynical as being smarter. So if you start talking about something from a hope-based perspective, you're running flat into, do I seem foolish? Am I uninformed? All of these kinds of things. So to really recognize the narratives that hold us in place so that we can look at them and say, they just don't fit anymore. What kinds of things do we know are moving us in the directions we need more of? And how do I spread that kind of information? It's being able to sit with ands rather than falling into, I've actually become quite impatient when someone is simply telling me how broken something is. I try to create space for the feeling of that because I think that's really important to express those feelings. However, it's not a fulsome story. Eve Tuck is a wonderful Indigenous researcher who talks about this concept of pain stories. We are just bathed in negative news. And it's not that it isn't important to know the problems we face. That is important. But if we only stop there and 97% of what we're hearing about is the problem, then we really are only left with sort of cheering ourselves up, rather than saying, actually, we deserve, it's a justice issue to have access to information about what works. We really deserve to know more about this. So there's, I think, really recognizing the media environment in which we live and saying it's not acceptable. There's these terms like doom scrolling, right? Word of the year a few years ago, because it is what we do. We move from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. It's an actual thing of doom scrolling. And what it reminds me of is we still have a lot of power in that. You can hold power accountable by knowing what works. You can say, this is happening in this city, I demand it in my city. So coming from a solutions orientation is a powerful political choice about wanting something appropriate. I think that remembering that our emotions are contagious, both face-to-face and online. So if we choose to doom scroll and then share our doom, we are making a choice to disempower ourselves and the people we care about that we're sharing with. And if we make a choice to instead, really look from a solutions orientation of what is moving in a better direction and share that, we're making a different choice. And I think a really necessary choice. We can never be disconnected from nature because we are nature. We are made up of all of these other species that are living within whatever we call our collective body. All of our processes, from the water we drink to the food we eat, are intimately tied to other species. So the idea that we can never be disconnected from nature is, to me, kind of a funny idea because it never occurs.
Welcome to your journey to find true tranquility with the Tranquility Magazine podcast. With your host, Jasmine Maya Royce. Today's episode features. You can find more information about Tranquility on our website, tranquilitymagazine.com.
Today I have Elin Kelsey. She's a PhD, is a award-winning author, speaker, and thought leader. She regularly leads workshops for environmental organizations, youth climate activism, educators, and community groups on hope and the climate crisis. Elin has written numerous best-selling children's books, including You Are Stardust. She has served as a visiting fellow at the Rachel Carson Center of Environment and Society, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Kone Foundation, the Salish Sea Institute, and the Cairns Institute, along with the Stanford University. She is the author of How to Be Hopeful, Empowering Practices, and Overcoming Despair, and Acts of Climate Justice. I'm delighted to have you today, Elin, and excited to talk about your book.
Thanks very much, Jasmine. It's great to be here.
So my first question is always, what is your current mantra or state of mind?
Yeah, I think it's a mantra that I've been carrying for a while now, which is just to consistently remind myself to choose to be hopeful. It's something I find I have to do on a regular basis. And I think especially in these times when we're bombarded with so many gloom and doom issues, when we really feel the weight of so many things happening around us, it's super easy and understandable to fall into a habit of feeling like we're good and they're getting worse, things are just getting wrecked. And I think when we choose to be hopeful, rather than saying my hope is based as a response to what's happening around me, instead it's a choice I'm making to respond to the very real issues that we face. So my mantra is to consistently say to myself, I choose to be hopeful, and then to look at the issues I'm facing from a hopeful, solutions-oriented perspective.
Yeah, it's very good. And it's a very deep understanding about, and you express that a lot in your book about that state of mind as part of your daily practice in a very much overwhelming society that is, for me, even as everyone else, I don't even know where to begin some days that you're like, there's so many things that I can do to make a difference, but where do I even begin? And then you kind of do that shutdown method that you just go about your day, which you express. But first, I wanted to talk about the idea of how you pivoted into this direction in your life and what called you to be more open-minded and exploratory in environmental organization and environmentalism.
Yeah, I've been working in sort of the ways in which we engage with the big issues of our time, especially from the greater than human world perspective. So, thinking about other species and our relationship to this incredible planet that we live on, and whether that's climate justice or whether that's biodiversity loss or plastic pollution. I've been working in that area since my 20s, and I'm now 63, so a very long time. And
Mm.
during that time, I would say there was a consistent belief that if people knew better, they would act better, sort of this privileging of intellectual thought. And what I think has been a wonderful development in maybe last decade, is a real recognition within conservation science and other areas that how we feel is actually crucially important to how we engage with things. It's our feelings that drive us to stick with difficult challenges, and to stay with things. Feelings of pride can be the most important thing of feeling in an alliance with others around, things that really matter to us. And so there's been this whole rise of a field called climate emotions. So
Mhm.
researchers looking at the ways in which we feel about these difficult issues, what that tells us about, sort of where we are. We know really disturbing things such as 42% of the world is 25 years of age or younger, which is a great thing. I love that we're a
Mhm.
young planet. But about three-quarters in the largest international survey to date of those people feel overwhelmed by eco-anxiety or environmental grief. And when we feel those things, we feel very unable to engage. So we may feel super passionate about climate change and want change. But if we're overwhelmed by grief and despair, we actually become we just can't act on the things we really love and care about. And so I really started feeling in the last, I don't know, years, 20 years maybe, that focusing on emotions from an evidence-based perspective was a really important addition. And so I wrote a book called Hope Matters about 5 years ago, where I was really laying out the case for hope, why it's actually super necessary at times of great loss or despair or challenge or crisis or injustice. And for the last 5 years, I've done lots of talks and workshops and met with a lot of people, and it's been wonderful all over the world. And what I really came to learn through that is that holding on to hope is a practice. It's
Mhm.
something we have to continue to do. And so this book, How to Be Hopeful, is a book of practices of how to sort of put into your life in a collective fashion these things that enable us to come at the issues that matter most to us in our most empowered state.
Yeah, I mean, even just starting into the book that you currently have, How to Be Hopeful, it is like a lean in moment when you start. I'm happy you have purchased this. And, you
Mhm.
know, hope is a thing. If you're looking for hope, we always want to feel like we are hopeful and in our own way, but the shutdown method is very much out there about overwhelm and too much information. We are a society, especially for the younger generation that you mentioned, social media, everything, we end up with a fish brain that we can only process about 10 seconds or 20 seconds at a time, that we're so overwhelmed, but we are in that system that we need constant like reinforcement, entertainment, engagement of any sort. So we feel like we're a part of something, but we're not. We're deviating from that. And having practices and methods in place for, the knowledge and the tutelage that you've experienced and all the people you met is kind of a really pivotal moment that you can start seeing. I always say, put on somebody else's shoes to see your perspective and your experience, to and learn and engage from your viewpoint, that we don't have to be overwhelmed by this. But take us on a journey in exploring some of the difficulties in finding the idea of hope in our world when you are delving into this book and the different sections that we're going to embrace.
Yeah, I really, really struggled with trying to find the structure for this book. Some books you can think, oh, I'll just lay it out like this. I wrestled and wrestled and wrestled. And I think the reason I wrestled so much is that um, we live so much in narratives. We're taught these grand ideas about what is a good life, what are our ways of being. There's lots of narratives around gender. We live in all of these narratives. And I think as a person involved in environmental conservation and sustainability for many decades, I've been very aware of colonialism and capitalism and the challenges of these great systems that have, really structured the way in which this planet is operating, and the dilemmas of the global South and the global North. All of those ideas, I think I intellectually knew, but when I sat down to write this book about hope, I really started to realize this book has to be situated with an assumption that injustice is a systemic issue that permeates really all aspects of our life, and that we need to challenge at its core ideas of capitalism in the same ways that we need to challenge ideas around colonialism and all of those things. And I think it meant that I was really consciously trying to recognize narratives that have just been taken for granted norms in my life and unlearn them. And so I've come to really realize that unlearning is incredibly hard. It's incredibly hard, not only because, we walk around and we say things before we even think, most of us,
Yeah.
but also there's so much social currency around. Like, one of the ways we express that we care about something as a social norm is that we will commiserate with each other,
Oh, yes.
we will really say, and we have this whole perception if someone is cynical. There's actually research that shows that we judge those who are cynical as being smarter. So if you start talking about something from a hope-based perspective, you're running flat into, do I seem foolish? Am I, uninformed? All of these kinds of things. So to really recognize the narratives that hold us in place so that we can look at them and say, they just don't fit anymore. And so I think the challenge for me in writing this book was to move from my intellectual knowledge to a really felt position around what I need to continue to unlearn and what are practices that help me to do that. And so that's part of holding on to hope.
Yeah, I love the fact, one, that you have a scientific background. And in my experience in science, it's a very narrow, one-driven idea that doesn't incorporate like some openness to change when it evolves. There has to be a lot of data to confirm it, to, get a new resolution or a new outcome that takes a long time for scientists specifically to pivot and change a little bit. But going back to specifically what you said about our inner narratives and our like misery love company, that's one of those phrases that have been out there for eons. And I totally understand it. But when I changed my experience and was more optimistic, hopeful, no matter what my situation is, I am now appearing stupid, dumb, or inadequate because I'm naive in my like overall mental structure that something must be wrong with me.
Yeah. And I think, I've really come to believe strongly in telling stories of ands. It's this and it's that. I'm really aware of the, vast problems that we face on this planet. And at the same time, I'm making a conscious choice to look at what kinds of things do we know are moving us in the directions we need more of, And how do I spread that kind of information? So it's being able to sit with ands
Mm.
rather than falling into. I've actually become quite impatient when someone is simply telling me how broken something is,
Oh,
and
yeah.
I try to create space for the feeling of that because I think that's really important to express those feelings. However, it's not a fulsome story. You know, Eve Tuck is a excuse me, a wonderful Indigenous researcher who talks about this concept of pain stories. If we think as a theory of change that if we just talk about how badly something is doing, or you know how wrongly it was treated, or how a community is facing these terrible challenges, those things may be true and should be spoken about. But
Mm.
if we stop there, it's a faulty theory of change. It disempowers the people engaged in that, and it does not recognize also the resilience that exists within those communities, also the demands of those and voices of those communities. So I really appreciate Eve Tuck's view that we want to move from damage-centered views of change to desire-centered views of change that see the full problem as it is and the ways in which people and other species are responding to those real problems.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more as I have changed my direction for more optimism and gratitude. Sometimes I find myself in a situation that I have, impartments from friends that are so dark and dismal that I have a tendency that I can't sit with it. I'm like, I totally understand. I want to be a sympathetic friend. I want to understand. I want to be there for you, but I feel depleted as my energy drains from self to help you to fill your cup. I feel drained and I depart the situation feeling depleted. And it's not like someone that has done that work that you move into more of a connection, more energetics, more hopeful, that you have so much to give. And then it just has, you walk away from a conversation or a motivational or a speech like something from yourself. You're like, I'm inspired. Let's go. I'm in. Like, what do we need to do here? Because that's the joy that you have to find in order to inspire other people. And I get you that you need to kind of change that inner monologue. I call
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
when you said ands, all I think of was ants.
Oh, yeah,
ANTS isn't no, it's an abbreviation
yeah.
for automatic negative thought patterns.
Oh, very
And I
interesting.
love that
Yeah,
abbreviation because, okay, we all love bugs in our own way. But as you mentioned in your book about camping, I love camping. And the season of heat, the ants will swarm. They need food. They're an entire community. There's great things about ants, but you don't want them to invade your house because outside, great, inside, no.
yeah. Exactly,
We
exactly.
keep the ants outside the house. So keep your negative thoughts there too.
Yeah, yeah, it's so tricky, I think, because one of the things we're trying to do is not position hope as in opposition to, say, anger or outrage or
Mm,
fear or sadness. You know, we understand that we can hold many emotions at the same time. You know, like we often feel a lot of things all at the same time. Um, and it's important to recognize that our feelings about things are a direct response to what's actually happening
mhm.
and also to how we hear about it. And we know that less than 3% of all media about climate change, for example, even mentions a solution. So it means that we are just bathed in negative news. And it's
Yeah.
not that it isn't important to know the problems we face, that is important. But if we only stop there and 97% of what we're hearing about is the problem, then we really are only left with sort of cheering ourselves up, you know, rather than saying, actually, we deserve, it's a justice issue to have access to information about what works. You know, we really deserve to know more about this. So there's, I think, really recognizing the media environment in which we live
Mhm.
and saying it's not acceptable is part of this, is that really feeling what we feel and then saying, why am I feeling this? I'm feeling this because I really love something and I care about it, and because I'm only ever hearing about how broken it is. And that's not okay.
Yes. I mean, you distinctively identified a question that I have for you based around the news and how oversaturated we can be by the news. And I've worked in the news for years in my own regard, as I have degrees in journalism, which, at this point, I am not wanting to realm into that endeavor in a way that I have like directed myself to inspirational elements. That there is a great Just for You that I saw. I think it's called an app called Inspired. And it is a motivational aspect of environmentalism and people on the pinnacle of change, and mostly from Europe for the most part, but not getting enough social media or news recognition for this specifically, that they are doing like, different ways of plastics and, trash reconstruction and art forms and all kinds of things that they're out there. It's just they don't get the headlines because the headlines are based on fear, because the more you fear it, the more you want to get engaged. But there's also those elements that you walk away going, what did I just listen to?
Yeah, and I think it's intriguing to me that this assumptions about what the news is or should be. There's a lot of fascinating research, as you're well aware as a journalist. Um, they've been tracking globally this issue of news avoidance, for example. So news
Mm-hmm.
avoidance is when we just can't take it anymore. If you're just hearing about how wrecked something is, you just stop listening or watching or engaging. And for me, that's kind of an inspiring idea that we're following that, because the rise of news avoidance, which is happening all over the world,
Mm-hmm.
is helping to drive something which is an emerging field of journalism called solutions journalism. And in solutions journalism, what you're doing is looking just as rigorously at what things move us in a direction that is working as you do at what's broken. And there's a whole solutions journalism network now that is more than, I think it's 1,700 news outlets around the world. There's a real movement in journalism schools towards solutions journalism, because it is a more fulsome idea of understanding what's happening on the planet and within our own communities. And what's been intriguing to me is it takes more time to do a solutions journalism story, because you have to look across contexts. You have to look at, the solutions are often through collectives, whereas we can, as an individual, look at how broken something is, And so I really think this rise of news avoidance doesn't serve media outlets. They don't want you to turn off. So that will help, in my opinion, I hope, the rise of more and more solutions journalism, which is what we need. We need access to that kind of information.
This is a rabbit hole that I could delve into too much for this, but I will absolutely agree with you that I am guilty of being a news avoidant because it's created.
Understandable. Yes.
It's like, and then it's so bang, 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 so many things all at once. And I'm like, I'm a headliner reader, and I am, I get my news in different ways, sometimes with a comedic angle because I need something to laugh about. But also the reality is the reality that I still have to be aware to make important decisions in my life, especially with voting or anything like that, that I need to be cognitive and I need to be embraced for all elements. But the news and the ownership is a very different element. And every writer that's a great writer or a great news producer are all directed by ownership. So no matter what they think, say, or feel about something, you still have to write in the narrative that they agree on. So, but yes, you need to be well informed and finding exactly what you said, like more fulfilling content of our engagement, because the days are hard enough for most people to move on to their day-to-day environment, their family, being a provider, being, a business person or a worker, just to make enough to get by is very important, to not sit around and see the entire negativity of the world in a social box of information.
Yeah, I mean, it really creates a fear culture, and that's a very disempowering thing. And I think when I was putting the book together, I was specifically thinking about stances. A stance is a posture that you take, and I like thinking about that in a physical way. So one of the stances is I choose to be hopeful. I choose hope. Another stance is I reject fatalistic doom. And what's happening in a lot of that news reporting is this fatalistic doom. So it's not only reporting on what's happening at the moment, but this statement about, and it's going to be worse, and it's going to be that. To me, that is irresponsible, because if we can stay in the fear, if we can say, I really see what's happening here and it's deeply concerning to me and I feel terrified by it. If I can stay in the fear of not taking that next step and saying, and that means that's going to happen. Because as soon as you go to fatalism, you remove all your agency, because it's already happened. It's already done. It's already a foregone conclusion. And I think if we really care about stuff, we have to say, I'm just not going to buy into that. I will not participate in fatalistic doomism. I'll participate in outrage and fear and despair and anger and joy, but I will not participate as if any of us knows that this thing is automatically determined to cause this next thing before it's even happened. And I think that's a really, really important justice stance to take for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, it brought me back to the pandemic in that time that we weren't really engaged with a lot of people. We weren't, socialization. Also, it brought me back to that movie V for Vendetta. And sometimes I view it in a weird way that, the control of that, what is it you're calling it? Doom?
Fatalistic doomism.
Yeah, fatalism. I'm always going to say that wrong. But
It's
I,
okay.
I totally understand that it's just like we're already terrified and we have no social engagement. We're alone in our own mental box here to have conversations, and we're learning what's going on in the world that we're not able to see by these other people that are saying what it is, no matter if it is exactly how it is. And that is a very hard difficulty where you're not experiencing life in general. Like you are in your own little cave by yourself, alone, and maybe you have a couple people that you call and talk to that are your friends or family, but they also have views that may be different from yours. And then you end up back into that doomsday thing. What's the point of talking about it? Because, everybody's got to have a point of view that is not mine, and I don't know even where to stand on that regard. But
Yeah. And I think there's these terms like doom scrolling, right? It was a
doom
word of the
scrolling,
year
yeah.
a few years ago, because it is what we do. We move from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. It's an actual thing of doom scrolling. And what it reminds me of is we still have a lot of power in that. You can hold power accountable by knowing what works. You can say, this is happening in this city. I demand it in my city. So coming from a solutions orientation is a powerful political choice about wanting something appropriate. And I think that remembering that our emotions are contagious, both face to face and online. So if we choose to doom scroll and then share our doom, we're making a choice to disempower ourselves and the people we care about that we're sharing with. And if we make a choice to instead, really look from a solutions orientation of what is moving in a better direction and share that, we're making a different choice. And I think a really necessary choice to have the kinds of communities and planets that, that matters.
Yeah, I mean, you have to figure out what direction you're going to take in your own environment, your own economical landscape, your neighborhood, your state, or all the different aspects. And what are you related to? What makes you happy? What makes you have joy? What makes you feel empowered, inspired, or being a creator of any regard? Because I believe creativity is one of the things that no matter how old you get, you still have to be creative, because the younger generation needs to inspiration from the older generation to teach us why creativity is part of being human, in my understanding. But then you hinted at it a little bit before, and I want to dive in a little bit deeper on your section about emotions. And true as I am a woman and we feel all kinds of emotions. I have been able to change that into compartmentalization when it comes to work, that we do not feel anything until we need to go home and cry it all out and experience the emotions that we need to get off, out, and into something else, because we don't need to harbor them or carry them with us. But you have you already hinted at it before about the emotions that come up for this. Can you expand and teach us and tell us what you have learned and gathered?
Yeah, there's so much emotions research, and one of the things I think important to look at in that is that there's this acronym WEIRD, which talks about a lot of the research that we have learned about emotions comes from a very select group of people, which are Western, I never get the acronym right, it's in the book, educated, essentially what it is college-aged males, of a certain demographic.
Regard. Yeah.
Yeah. And then that gets taken, this very small sample, and has been sort of the norm of psychological research and put on to women and people of however gender identifying they are, and different cultures and different countries as if we're all uniform. But of course, what do we know is that individuality, diversity, it's a really narrow idea, and it's actually inaccurate to do research in just one small group and then say, oh, it applies to everybody. So there's been this explosion of research as we're diversifying our understanding of emotions and how culturally based they are and how individually and experientially they're based, and how we have a lot of capacity around our emotions to both feel them and also make choices about how we express them. So anger, as I said earlier, is a very welcome emotion around injustice. We should be angry when things are unjust. And a lot of the systems in which we're operating on a national and global basis are unjust. And so recognizing anger, and rather than perhaps following a narrative that says, oh, it's not right to be angry, or I need to constrain myself, there's lots of researchers who talk about just as diverse ways, I'm capable of saying, oh, I have love for a partner, or I have love for my children, or I have love for a beautiful sunny day. I can express lots of kinds of love. There are lots of kinds of anger, and just to increase our capacity to decide which of those do I want to express right now and in what ways, rather than this idea that emotions are needed to be suppressed. They're only one thing, they're unidimensional, they're right or wrong. These ideas are just so restrictive. And another way in which fear culture rules, if we just don't express our diversity of the wonderful people we are.
So many directions I can go with this in ways that it is important to understand, feel, express, and be authentic with your emotions. To suppress them all creates health issues. And a lot of research and a lot of interviews that I've done to validate the idea that the more you suppress your anger, fear, or anything that is not joyful and love, you are going to get something. As I was formerly a massage therapist, we call it a backpack of woes, where you pick and keep your emotions. Mostly for gentlemen, it's lower back, feeling financially unsupported and emotionally unsupported because they're not allowed to come out. Women have it on the shoulders for the most part. We carry others here, one for you, one for other people, and we have a lot of shoulder pain. And so it can be different depending on your body stature and your upbringing and lifestyle and your chosen distinctified, he, she, they, them, and kinds of rides it out for a pinnacle amount of time that you end up with all these ailments that you have not expressed yourself, or you don't feel like you can, or no one's heard you, or you didn't say it right, or you just making people mad at you when you say what you actually think. And I think it's so important as a woman and being a woman to understand where my emotions are living and what they're saying. Because by knowing and understanding my own emotions, they can be truth tellers in an experience that I need to express why I'm angry about that, or what boundary do I need to put up, or what do I need to change in my world to not encounter that angry, fear, or dooms perspective. So I think it's very important that you have a whole section on emotions, because this is a topic that is about a very emotionally driven concept. And I think for me, it is a field that I have been inquisitive about for a long time, but I am not an expert in any regard. But I also understand that you equip yourself with the acts of expressing some details in this element of teaching all a little bit about what the differences in the overwhelming world seems to be in touch with in handling their emotions. You have a practice that you speak about in this, about understanding your emotions and kind of working through them, which I think it's very important to endeavor into your emotions and try to find a practice that works for these reasons that we have discussed. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's, decisions we can make. And I really appreciate what you said about just accepting all of our emotions, just really and recognizing them in the first place, and then deciding, would I like to use them to do something? But they are in themselves wise and helpful to us in question. So if we wanted to shift towards more empowering emotions, for example, there's a practice in 5 parts in the book. So the first starts, of course, you just said beautifully, the emotions that sit in our backs or on our shoulders, or, just figuring out where, focusing on your body, where are your emotions sitting? What are you actually feeling? What energy do you feel? Just really touching in with yourself. And then secondly, really thinking about your surroundings. I know for myself, my emotions are really upregulated when I'm in terrible light, like I'm a 100% outside person. And so if I'm in an environment that's super noisy with a lot of artificial light, my emotions are different than they would be in another place. Third part, considering the past experiences that are really shaping these emotions. What are the triggers you might be feeling? Where are those things coming from? And then the fourth one I think is really important, which is we have a lot of capacity to cultivate new experiences that change our emotions if we wish to, so that emotions aren't just something that happen to us and we're, forever victimized by them, have them happen. They are things that we have a lot of energy around. We can talk about different cultural practices around emotions, how others might deal with sadness, for example, in ways that could be helpful to us. Those sorts of things, we can cultivate new experiences. And then finally, really creating moments of release. We want our emotions to help us, inform us, give us the wisdom they have, and then release them so they aren't, dragging along behind us as our day is unfolding in different ways. And so just that's one small practice within there, this 5-part way of examining what I'm feeling and what it is the agency I have around that.
Yeah, I think it's important the elements of practices that you put in place for everyone to kind of work through. And because a lot of this has, familiarity of mental health as part of it. And to understand your environment is your mental world. Welcome to your heaven or your hell in that concept without being biblical, but it's a very familiar term for those out there to understand you create your own world. And the only one that can solve or change it is you. So, in understanding there's certain things you need to tap in, touch in, and get into self, because I have lived in moments in my world that I was external to self. Like I feel like I'm living my life, but I am not in body. Like I feel like I'm out of body and I have no idea that I'm not listening to my gut intuition, my instincts, my, where something is misaligned in my body that's telling me that I'm holding on to something that I need to get out and deal with and or change, your environment. As you said before, I like being outside in nature. I can't tell you how much I love nature. I was raised by a horticulturist, so I was raised in nature that I love, the trees are the wisdom keepers. You express a couple poetic moments about the trees and being in nature. And that is a reset, I think, that people need to be informed of being involved in nature. And you have a great section about this. And I want you to educate us all a little bit about being part of the nature in our world and how we relate to our species as part of this.
Yeah, it's so the book has 5 stances, around one around hope, one around rejecting doomism, one around I'm emotional, one around really seeing that we're on a reparative quest on Earth because of so much injustice and feelings of institutional betrayal, not being able to count on organizations and systems we should be able to depend on. And then the fifth is that we just are nature. This is a stance of knowing I am nature. There are 8.7 million other species. you and I are only talking and breathing because of other, plants and aquatic plants in the ocean. Like
Mhm.
we are in nature. There's no question about it. And one of the things I think is a really big source of hope for myself is that those other species are also full of agency and resilience. And so often when we're talking about the state of the world, we talk only about humans. And it's
Mhm.
important to talk about humans because we are humans and we have responsibilities as humans.
Mhm.
I'm not saying we shouldn't. However, I think the more that we recognize the resilience of other species, the more that we are able to see ourselves as part of this much bigger system, um, where things are transforming and happening that really matter. So, for example, when we saw the horrific fires going through Australia, I mean, we see them in many places, but in the particular Black Summer that we saw a few years ago, where a quarter of the landmass burned, there was a real tendency to report on that and the losses of animals. There was a really major headline that went through most media saying, over 3 billion animals killed. That
Mhm.
is a hugely upsetting, terrible thing. What I think is important there is that that statistic turned out not to be accurate because, in
Mhm.
fact, it's all kinds of animals have lots of ways of dealing with fire. They're
Mhm.
not helpless victims. They're also agentic individuals and cultures and groups. It's not to say that those fires are okay. They absolutely are not. And the climate change conditions that led to those and other forestry practices that contributed are not okay. I think it's also really important to know that that resilience exists and then to look, a few years later, what kinds of things happened within those forests since then. That should
Mhm.
also be reported on, the rise of trees who support each other through their fungal root networks.
Mhm.
And you see in some cases the fires absolutely were so inferno-like that it was
Mhm.
completely destructive. But in other areas, we see this resilience. And so I think we need to be comfortable talking about these ambiguities in life,
Mhm.
that things can be horribly broken and things can be also extremely resilient. And when we see ourselves as part of a bigger ecosystem that has those same qualities, we're
Mhm.
much more able to support the resilience that's there. So lots of work around marine protected areas, for example, in
Mhm.
areas where corals have a higher capacity to deal with ocean temperature rise. So again, I'm not saying it's okay that ocean temperatures are rising. We need to deal with climate change so that we help to bring that not to be the case. And at the same time, recognizing when we put marine protected areas into places where some corals have more resilience like that, then we can in fact support that resilience. So it's a really thinking of all of us as alive and part of something rather than humans only and animals or plants as being either things or kind of non-agentic.
Yeah, I think you hit a very realization moment for me and inspiration because I've been working on this and through this. I am a fire victim here in California.
Yes.
So I totally understand that I didn't want to be the defeatism. I didn't want to embrace the idea that you can't rejuvenate an area, especially with the chemical aspects that are part of what has seeped into our groundwater and our earth and how we couldn't drink water for a while and it has seeped into the ocean. I went to one of my meetings at the Mycology Society for mushroom people,
Yeah.
and it was about what you exactly pinpointed that there's these mushrooms that they're now putting into the earth to absorb the chemicals out of the earth and kind of rejuvenate the area. Because I'm looking at as a farmer and agricultural aspect of planting and what we can do with these environments. And then all the washout of all these fire things into our ocean created the devastation when it comes to marine life. And it was very important to kind of what are we going to do in the next situation by that? And, across LA, there's a lot more animals in everybody's backyard now because they have escaped the area that was more foresty and more close to water, where they kind of understood that that was their home environment. They lost it too. So we see more coyotes in the middle of the city now where you wouldn't before. But it reminded me of the sequoias the trees that we have in California that need fire in order to grow. Because without the fire, when they didn't do any in the national park, they realized that the sequoias were getting older and new ones were not starting because they were controlling the environment. And now they have controlled burns to enforce the idea of the sequoias blooming and creating themselves going forward. So,
Exactly. Yeah. So I think the more exactly that, the more we can take this ecosystem worldview. I'm not in any way saying, oh, don't worry about what happens because things will just recover.
no,
I'm not saying that at all. I want to
no.
be really clear. But what I am saying is we really need to look at, just as you said, the practices that we use in these experiences and making choices, different choices around those. So a number of things within the book are informed through Indigenous practices and traditional ecological knowledge, and the return in British Columbia, for example, of more Indigenous fire protection practices, which include controlled burns as being part of a regular part of policy response. So
Mhm.
we have a lot of collective wisdom on Earth, and when we look from a solutions orientation and we say what things are most effective in fire situations and which are most effective from a ecosystem standpoint, the most we see different things, and then that allows us to throw our energy behind that
Mhm.
rather than a taken for granted idea that, well, it's just going to keep happening and it's terrible and helpless.
Mhm. I think there's so many environmental moments for every state here in, the United States, from tornadoes to fires. We have, California, we're known for fires and earthquakes. Those are the two that we see more often. Then you have other states that are affected by tornadoes and floods, and we have some of those as well. But also we're part of this environment that we cannot control nature. Sometimes you have to figure out how to change with it or how to nurture it or how to grow with it. And I think for the large portion of humanity, we have evaded the connection with the planet in ways that we're city dwellers. And we live in a city that we have infrastructures of huge buildings and less trees and more noise and more, cars and lots more activity base in a city environment where we don't have as much of a connection with our nature and our environment external to these. Sometimes we want to go there, but then we get controlled, as I'm equally accountable to being a workaholic and, living in a certain place that I have to remind myself to leave and reset myself to make sure that I know where I am and why I'm living here.
I might say to you, I think I would say to you, we can never be disconnected from nature because we are nature.
Mhm.
We are made up of all of these other species that are living within whatever we call our collective body. All of our processes, from the water we drink to the food we eat, are intimately tied to other species. So the idea that we can never be disconnected from nature is, to me, kind of a funny idea because it never occurs. It just
Mhm.
doesn't occur. It's a language we use.
Mhm.
It's the way we talk. I don't know if you heard that crow just go over,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
we are nature. And because we're nature, then, I think it's been fascinating to watch the rise of the greening of cities. So you're right, we live on an urban planet and we are seeing the more and more cities being built. And we are seeing across the global north and the global south, more slowly, but because of justice reasons, but also this greening occurring. And in fact, it turns out that more species live within cities than live, for example, in monocultural croplands. So cities turn out to be very important places for other species. And the number of things that are going on around that is really important to know about. So you can advocate for those within your own community too. So the book is full of examples like this that are trying to challenge these assumptions we have, that cities are just places that are devoid of nature. In fact, one of the quickest growing hobbies in the United States is urban birding because so many people are really interested in birds. And there's a
Mhm.
beautiful connection between, I think it's bird watching in the sense that, we can now take Instagram
Mhm.
photos, we can take photos through our phones and put them on Instagram and share
Yeah.
them in ways we couldn't see before. But a lot of research now shows us that if you care about the birds and you're watching them, you
Mhm.
are much more likely to be engaged in ecological restoration or
Yeah.
demanding the protection of a park in your neighborhood or
Mhm.
more trees within a neighborhood, which is a social justice issue because trees are really closely tied to good health and
Mm-hmm.
really, so looking at which parts of the city have trees and why doesn't my part of the city have trees?
Mm-hmm.
So all of these things are really active and happening. And so I would say we're not disconnected. We are absolutely unable to be disconnected. We are nature.
I couldn't agree with you more. I'm not saying that I was ever disconnected. I was lucky enough to live in a lot of environments. You made a story come to mind when I lived in Silver Lake and I decided to do a little pond and I did all the digging and put all the fish in it. I was like very excited that I kept coming out and I met like 40 fish. And then I came out, I was like, it seems like I'm missing some. And then I came out like, another week, there was like, there's less fish in here. I was like, okay. And then I ended up catching an entire family of raccoons. They ate all my fish, but they've become part of my family that I ended up feeding them and they would hang out because they had two little babies and two, a mama and a papa, and they were living in this tree that I had at my property at that point. And I'm like, well, if I don't have fish, I have raccoons instead. I think they're very smart creatures. So I'm always about where my environment has trees because I think they are, as you said, the breathing of the freshness of the air and your environment that you need more of these in order to have better quality of air and breathing space and to advocate for them. I am a tree hugging hippie. So yes, I will
Yeah.
hug some trees for you because I think they're older, wiser than all of us, and they've seen more than we have. That quote they say, I wonder what these walls have seen. I think about what these trees have seen, years and
Exactly.
lifetimes.
Yeah.
Some of them are hundreds of years old that we're lucky enough to have here in California. But it is the idea that your environment is surrounded by things that you need to be more aware of. If birds visit, you had a crow pass by. I love ravens, which are part of the crow, and murderer crows that are important because they are very interesting and clever creatures. They need puzzles, they love to solve, they love gifts, and they will come and hang out with you. So if you can be a friend to a crow, you are starting that journey where people have hummingbirds that they love. We're lucky in California that we
Yeah.
have those.
Yeah.
But, being involved. I would like to ask, what question should I have asked that we didn't touch upon that you think is very relevant to share?
I think for a lot of people, maybe the question would be that doesn't suggesting people be hopeful, isn't it just creating complacency? A lot of people really worry that if you approach something from a hopeful perspective, people are just going to say, oh, okay, there's no problem. I don't have to do anything. That's a
Mhm.
really big concern that people hold around hope. But the research shows it's exactly the opposite, that if you feel hopeful, then there are two emotions that are really cause us to take action. One is hope and one is anger. We feel really hopeful about something or feel really angry, we act.
Mhm.
And hopelessness, the opposite, hopelessness causes us to feel apathetic. It causes us to feel we can't act. And so there isn't really a danger of hopefulness causing complacency. It's a misworry. But
Mhm.
there is a big and a lot of documentation that when we feel overwhelmed, helpless, hopeless, in despair, we
Mhm.
can't act. And so I think it's really a question to really talk about a lot is that this assumption of complacency is holds us back from taking a hopeful perspective, and
Yeah.
it actually just feeds more um, fear-based stuff that causes us to not act on behalf of what matters.
True. I think for a lot of people, fear is familiar. And that change that you need to make to go for the unfamiliar is part of the journey of life in the aspect that you're willing to change or be open to receive. And then the concept of being familiar with the idea that not everything in life should create fear for you. If you can find your self foundation and have your inner support system already set up that you can explore different aspects of unknown environments because from your upbringing to your current place right now, it is important to not perpetuate the fear dialogue or the emotions that go behind it, unless absolutely anger, as you said, is a force to be reckoned with. So right now we have both sides of the paradigm in the fact that they're hopeful about a different world and some are angry about the current state, and both are aligned in a way that we're all on this journey in this earth together.
That's why I've been really inspired by, we saw those climate change marches just before the COVID epidemic hit. And a lot of people believed, then they just ended. There was no interest in climate change after that. But that's not what happened. In fact, there has been an ongoing increase in concern, global concern around climate change. And what youth have done is demanded that we see it as a climate justice crisis, not a climate change crisis, because of anger about injustice and because of really recognizing that, it's an intergenerational right to a healthy planet. And so I think this sitting together of hope and anger, to me, they sit beautifully together in these justice movements.
Yeah, I know that it kind of changed for you that you had workshop set up for the COVID and you were not able to go at that point, but it doesn't mean that something is not in your ether of your space, that it's not still happening. You're just not exposed to it. So you can open yourself up to look, and you have a whole section on, finding resources to be inquisitive about. And I always say, remain curious. Always be curious. There's a lot of people that say that, but I also understand that if you don't know, ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask. I play dumb all the time because sometimes I don't know and I want to learn, and being involved in something that calls to you. And I think that because you're an author of kids' books, it makes you understand the next generation coming into the environment that you have gifted them. And I understand. I'm not saying that we own anything, and we are not owners of this environment fully. We are just a part of it, but our generation has made an impact on it. And so what is the impact that we are going to make to give to the next generation to handle and be a part of? Because if we don't do that, we are at a detriment. And I think it is changing in a lot of aspects that we are coming to the forefront. And David Attenborough, sitting with my father watching one of his documentaries, we're talking about population control and the environment. If you love him, check out I think it's his recent one about where our climate is and all those aspects that we need to be aware of, that we don't have as many resources as we think we do. And we have used a lot of them, but it doesn't mean they're not out there. But how are we going to use what we have right now? And how are we going to impart for the future generations about sustainability? And I think very important. So my final two questions are always the first: what is the best advice you've ever received?
That is such a hard question because I think I'm constantly receiving advice feels like the best moment, because whatever we're grappling with, someone can really help us, So I really believe that because we need to create cultures of support, cultures of hope, those kinds of things, that advice is a big part of culture creation. So I'm always looking for advice, but I guess it really does come down to that idea that to be as authentic as you can be to whoever you are, because you're probably extremely good at being yourself. And so I'm excited to know that, for example, with climate engagement, there's nothing I can think of, whether you're a knitter, a pinball player, whatever. There are groups and networks of people who care about climate and pinball, those kinds of stuff. If you come from your unique personality, you're much more powerful and more able to do the good work in the world that you want to do, and to find others who care about what you care about. So finding what you're really passionate about, and then looking for others who are doing that too, rather than thinking, here's the top 3 things I have to do about this issue. Yeah. So being really authentically yourself. And I guess I am interested in radical honesty. I think it's really hard to be honest with myself and always, whatever circumstance, we have to be discerning, of course, but the more we're honest, I think we see that a lot of our emotions are shared, a lot of our dilemmas are shared, and then we find our way through them.
Yeah, it brings me back to last week. I was at this women's focused business conference, and a lot of people were asked questions to stand up and say what they wanted after or in the experience. And they all said, I want to meet people that are honest and upfront and clear on their perspective. I do not want anyone that's putting on a face to lead with the idea of being perfect, because no one is. And there was like 9 people that stood up asking for
Interesting.
authenticity from
Yeah,
everyone there to be actually who they are, because that's how we connect. It's like
exactly.
I'm in LA. LA is full of people putting on a stage act all the time, no matter where you are. If you're an actor or not, it is part of the concept. But I also understand that there's great people here, and there's very much, environments that you can find yourself in, that the topic just comes to mind, that you want to, like, what are you doing on this regard? Do you know anyone? Do you have a foundation that you like? Do you have something that I can volunteer for or be involved in? And I think that's just point of clarity. You know what you want, and you're looking and curious by nature to figure out if that's opportunity, because you just met someone the other day. And being who you are is better than being rejected for who you're not.
I agree.
So, my last question is, what is the biggest takeaway from the hardest lesson you've ever learned? And what did you take away learning for the next time you encounter something like this?
I think I didn't used to think that you can decide to love something, but I really have learned that you can decide to love something. And I think that is a very powerful thing, because to love something means you really have to pay close attention to it. You have to look at your biases. You have to see where
Mhm.
your assumptions don't serve you, and when you choose to love somebody, because I'm trying to think of a something, I like to think of plants and other species as somebodies. When you decide to make an active choice to love somebody,
Mhm.
um, all kinds of things open up. And so that was a very hard thing for me to learn, because I used to think it just happened to people or it didn't happen to people. But I've
Mhm.
made some conscious choices in my life to love species that I was taught to fear or to find
Mhm.
repulsive, those kinds of things. And the more I've practiced deciding to love somebody, the more I'm just blown away by the kind of incredible beauty of the planet.
Yeah, I think it's important too, as you were saying, about, anything with energy in my mind is alive. And I include electronics because I name mine. They have an energy of their own, and also plants,
Yeah.
environments, because most plants in your house or outside, they love either music or you connecting and talking to them. They perk up and they know. I think there was a recent study that says, like, plants in your home know you're coming when you're about 300 feet away.
Fascinating.
So, like,
Fascinating. Yeah.
it is, this is your home, your creatures, your creation. Even your dogs, animals, pets already know kind of where you are and when you're coming back, but you're further out than they know, but they have a feeling. They're much more in tune with them, their instincts and their intuition, to figure out, oh yeah, okay, you're on your way, you're not far. I know you're coming back for me. But also understanding all these aspects are part of your world. And, love is a very deep understanding that I had to embrace and be in touch with, because at one point in my life, I was so filled with love that I felt unworthy of it. It was too much for me, that I figured out that the environment is full of love. And if we can get there, it's a beautiful resource that you don't need from a specific person, but it's just in the sphere of our environment and how to tap into those things, because that takes a lot of work to get in hope
Mhm.
and be joyful about that. And when you love something and honestly do, it grows better.
Exactly. Exactly.
So,
Such a pleasure to speak with you. I really have
oh,
appreciated this.
it was an honor, and I want everybody to pick up the book. If you are curious by nature about being hopeful and exploring the ideas and the state of mind to figure out how to empowering practices to overcome despair and of climate justice. Please pick up the book. There's all kinds of practices in there. There's all kinds of sections to be truthful and honest with your emotions, and don't get bogged down in the doomism that we can't do anything to resolve it. And please check out all the notes in the bio and find Elin's website as well. You can inquisitively look at about her workshops and her other things that she's involved in, so you can be a part if you calls to you. But thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Great to speak with you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Tranquility Magazine podcast. Please subscribe and add your questions to our Q&A. We want to give a thank you to our team for their effort in creating every episode and our content at tranquilitymagazine.com.